Well, welcome to the first Sunday in 2015. Welcome our Sapulpa, our Coweta campuses, our online viewers. Glad to have you here for a brand new year. If I haven't told you yet, Happy New Year. You know, this time of year we do a lot of planning, evaluating, thinking about the new year. You probably have read through a whole lot of information about how to do this better, and maybe you've made some New Year's resolutions. We just do a lot of evaluating of the year before and planning for the year ahead. And I came across some information I thought would help maybe us start out a little bit. Each year, 37,000 men between the age of 18 and 50 die from an accident. So how about that to kind of start things off well? It's the leading cause of death for men in that age bracket, accident. Some of them unintentional death, some of them unavoidable, some of them just wrong place, wrong time. And so this time last year, Popular Mechanics put together a piece, an article titled How Not to Die. And it suggests that you can avoid some really unnecessary and even stupid accidents, and here's some examples of stuff they gave you. So here's just some helpful information, especially for you guys for 2015, but it's relevant to all of us. Each year, 3 to 5 people are killed in North America by sharks and bears. Some of that's completely avoidable. Here's how to plan, they said. Number 1, avoid shark-infested waters. How about that? Number 2, carry pepper spray when hiking. So that's all you got to do, and you could avoid being one of those few that die that way. We're told that more than 100 Americans drown every year in rip currents. Rip currents are those things that occur when water rushing from the shoreline is channeled back through a narrow gap between the sandbars. Here's how to plan for rip currents. Allow the current to carry you out beyond the riptide's flow, then swim laterally parallel with the shore until you find a place where you can swim safely back to shore. There you go. May have saved your life later. In 2012, 5 skydivers died after a low hook turn. That's when someone attempts a turn too close to the ground and hits the earth like a wrecking ball. Not a good thing. Instead, here's their recommendation. Plan by scoping out the landing spot well in advance so you have room to land without needing to swerve. I know that's a difficult one right there. Here's my favorite, last one, from 1978 to 1985, rocking and eventually tipping vending machines caused 37 deaths. Yes, you heard me right. Rocking and tipping vending machines. So here's planning advice from Popular Mechanics to save your life this year from dying due to vending machines. Number 1, plan ahead and buy your lunch, your soda, or snacks at the store. Number 2, don't fight vending machines. They have a weight advantage. So there you go. I hope that helps you for this new year. We've titled this sermon, Epistle 2015, simply because when you read through the epistles or the letters that the Apostle Paul writes different churches in the New Testament, there's kind of a common theme that flows along with that. Now, the Apostle Paul, he had to address churches head on. He had some major issues to deal with it. If you've read the letters, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, they were letters written to the church in Corinth, and there was some mixed up people in the churches. There were some crazy things that had to be addressed, and the Apostle Paul wasn't afraid to address those things. He critiqued, he rebuked anything that was out of line. He made sure that he spoke to that issue. But he spoke the truth, and when he did, he spoke it in love. He spoke the truth, but he spoke it in love. And when he started addressing those issues, he started by finding the good and praising something about the church. In fact, you can read that again, and especially 1 and 2 Corinthians. He started by commending them, by praising the church for the good things that they had done, and he did it sincerely. He affirmed them genuinely. He found good things, and then he moved on to things that he needed to speak the truth in love about. And so this morning, I want to do that with us as a church. I want to share some things that I think our church has done well, especially in this past year in 2014. And then I want to lovingly challenge us in some areas that I think we could see some improvement on. And I'm certainly not, let me just put you at ease, pretending to be inspired by God. I'm just simply using that epistle phrase as a way to kind of jump into this thing. And so let's start by just some areas that I think we can praise our church for and we can be proud about. One of those is just the way that we have cared for vulnerable children. It's become a value of our church. In fact, it's probably been a value since the beginning of the church, and one that we have just continued to fan the flame on. When you think about the things that we did over last year when it came to foster children and raising awareness for that and helping gather things and helping resource families that were foster parents. When you think about the things that Cedar Ridge did for the Laura Dester Emergency Shelter, the Tulsa County Emergency Shelter for kids that are in DHS custody, state custody, the things that we have gathered for those children to make life just a little easier for them when things are not in a good spot for them, and absolutely no fault of their own. When you think about the things that we did for Cookson Hills Christian Ministry, just an hour east of us, and one of our long-term partners has literally helped to raise thousands of kids because they were pulled out of their parents' home, or because they needed the more strict environment of a home like that, and they needed some hope and they needed some healing. And if you haven't been around this last year, we actually built walls on the campuses, all 3 campuses of our church, and we transported those, and in a couple of weekends we put all of those walls together and dried in houses for Cookson Hills, where kids eventually are going to live and going to hear the Word of God. When you start thinking about those kinds of things, not just here domestically, but in October, we had a time where we had friends from our India mission here, and we, as a church, sponsored 68 children in a village there that is a part of an unreached people group. And as a church, we're going to, individual families are going to support these kids and help them to be in an environment where they have an opportunity to hear the gospel. Not just internationally, our Coweta campus has packed backpacks with snacks for kids over the weekend. They have done that weekend after weekend after weekend, helping provide for kids that are in difficult situations. I love that about our church, about our caring for vulnerable children. And we have taken to heart this passage in Psalm 82:3, where God says, defend the weak and the fatherless. We've taken that seriously, and we've said we want to be a part of changing something about that. And so we've gathered our resources, and we've done it lots of different ways. In church, I'm proud of us for the way that we have tackled that, and we've made a difference in the lives of kids. Here's another area that I think we can be proud of with our church, and I want to commend our church for, is your rich generosity. The way that you have given, the way that you have resourced things, the way that you have financially embraced areas of ministry. It's been true just in providing with the normal things, being able to turn on the lights and pay salaries of a church, with a church of our size, over $1.5 million just to resource the basics like that and provide for areas of mission. But then you've gone beyond that. We just concluded our 3-year radical faith stewardship journey, and over the course of that time, an additional $1.5 million plus that you've given in that regard, and some amazing things have happened because of that. Like now, our church has a debt load that's under $200,000. And so we have drastically reduced that. And it's not just the money that you've given. You've given your time. You've given your vacations away. And some of you have spent time doing a mission trip in Mexico this past year. And we've had people in Jamaica, and we've had people in India, and we've had people in South Africa, and we've had people in Morocco. You have You have given generously. You have served our Sapulpa campus. I'm so proud of you. Your Serve Sapulpa that you have jumped in and embraced and people have grabbed hold of, and you're known in the community before that. And then we've got countless groups all over the area they're just doing things that go unnoticed. We've got a group that goes and feeds the homeless every month in downtown Tulsa, and just things like that just cause us to be proud of our rich generosity. It reminds me of 2 Corinthians 8:2. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. That's exactly what Paul's doing. He's commending the Macedonian churches, saying, that you're doing a great job. You just continue to give. And I want to encourage our church just to be that kind of gracious and giving and generous church. And let's continue to be known for that. There's another area that I think we can be proud of. I just want to commend you for taking care of each other. You've done a great job of doing that, of loving one another, of providing for one another. I love it when I hear about groups or classes that have gone above and beyond to take care of a member of their group. They've gone to visit them in the hospital, or they've provided meals for them. They've taken care of them. And quite honestly, that's why I wish everyone in our church was a part of a group or in one of our classes or one of our studies, because that's how we are the church for one another. It's in those smaller group settings that we can really provide the care and the love to one another. And again, you're living out what Paul said in Philippians 2:4. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others also. And so that's what I'm praying, that we'll continue to be that kind of church that cares for one another. And if you're not in some kind of group where you can be the recipient or be a participant in providing that kind of care, then you are missing out on an aspect that is fundamental to our church of just taking care of each other. And so there's the things that I think our church does well. I could probably mention dozens of others. You probably have your own ideas. In fact, if you do, I'd love to hear them. Email me or tell me about one when you see me, and let's talk about things that we can praise our church for. We've got a lot of things I think that we could celebrate, but I also want to spend some time where we just talk about some things that I think we need to correct. And so for us, as we look forward to 2015, I want to encourage and I want to challenge Cedar Ridge Christian Church in these areas right here. I've got 3 of those as well. One of those areas is, I think we've become comfortable. I think we've become comfortable. It's predictable in churches, and in fact, it's predictable in just about any organization where you get to the place where comfort just becomes an important value. In the church, it's called the Joshua predicament. It's one that many people know, Joshua in the Old Testament, and it becomes pretty predictable with churches, just like it was with God's people. Now, I know it was Moses that led God's people out of Egypt and towards the Promised Land, but it was Joshua that led the people into the Promised Land. And it was Joshua that led the army of God's people. And it was Joshua that led the people across the Jordan River. And it was Joshua that led the people in the attack against Jericho. And it was Joshua that led them, once they were in the Promised Land, led them into victory after victory, many of those accompanied by the miraculous from God. But then something happened. Those scrappers, those desert fighters, those courageous, brave people, after winning victory after victory, seemed to quit. They just stopped. They became comfortable. They seemed to quit, and the reason is because they became comfortable. They had conquered enough of the land to settle down, and when they did that, they never conquered the rest of it. And because they never conquered the rest of it, it was going to give them trouble throughout history. In fact, listen to what God tells Joshua. Joshua 13:1. When Joshua was an old man, the Lord said to him, "You are growing old, and much land remains to be conquered." In other words, Joshua, you've run out of time. Joshua, you've run out of momentum. He had not accomplished his God-given task because the people became comfortable. You know, Cedar Ridge started and was interested in taking the Great Commission to the community of South Tulsa, South Broken Arrow, and then beyond into the world. And the people who started Cedar Ridge Christian Church, some of them still here in our midst, those people were people of faith, people who were scrappers, people who were fighters. They had VBS meetings in backyards because there weren't any buildings. They met in schoolhouse cafeterias because there weren't any other places to have church. They knocked on doors. They invited friends. They shared the gospel because they had to. And they helped to build buildings. And since then, we've built more buildings, and we've started new campuses, and we've gotten a great staff assembled. And it's easy at this point to just say we're good. We're all right with that. It's easy to become comfortable. But there's so much more to be done for the Lord in Broken Arrow and in Sapulpa and in Coweta and in this whole South Tulsa area. There's so much more that needs to be done. We're nowhere near completing the task, and we've got to avoid this temptation of just resting, of just being okay with where we are, of being in a position where things are good. We've got to resist the urge to maintain the comfortable. We could go into a lot greater detail, but I want to move on into some other areas that I think we need to address. Another area we need to correct is we've failed to obey God completely. We failed to obey God completely. What's interesting is that Joshua, the people that followed Joshua, those people of God, they were guilty of doing the same thing. What God told them to do was, when you get into the land, I want you to conquer everybody, and I want you to either drive them out or I want you to completely annihilate them, because they are people who worship false gods, and I don't want that infiltrating my people. And so you do exactly what I say. And unfortunately didn't. Listen what happens, Judges 1:28. When the Israelites grew stronger, they forced the Canaanites to work as slaves. Wait a minute, I thought they were to drive them out. But they never did drive them completely out of the land. Well, let's take some of them as slaves. I mean, these people would be good for us. And so they used them as slaves. And again, part of the problem was that they began to adopt the Canaanites' false worship and idol worship. And so one of the things that I think we need to be careful of, just like God's people in the Old Testament, is we've got to fully obey God. What's God going to hold us as a church responsible for? What is it that God asks us to obey Him completely on? Might surprise you. It's really not how much we've grown. It's not how many people show up at our church. It's not how much money we give. It's not, how many missionaries we've got. It's not, how many activities that we've got going on. What is God going to hold us responsible for as a church? Are we making disciples or not? I mean, that's the essence of the Great Commission. Before Jesus leaving this earth, He looked at His disciples and He says, go and make disciples of all nations. It's that simple. As a church, we are called to make disciples. And the truth is that we're not effectively doing that. We're not doing that as good as we need to. It happens on a personal level when people decide that they are going to be disciple makers. When a church full of people say, we're going to be about what God calls us to do. We're going to make disciples. We're going to be intentional with the people around us. And here's the problem is we cannot rely upon people just showing up at church and saying we're going to make disciples of those people. In fact, this has been a period of time in our part of the world where people have just showed up at church, where people have just said, I know I need something and I'm going to show up at church, but we are quickly leaving that time frame in our world. In fact, some statistics tell us that all the church growth that's recorded in the United States right now is mostly people just going to another church, and it shows up as an addition for that church when, in essence, for the kingdom, it's not any church growth at all. And so people aren't coming to the church to look for things like they used to, which means we have to be about getting outside the walls of our church, and we have to be intentional. We have to leave the building, and we have to be missionaries. Maybe not in Africa, and maybe not in Mexico, but we've got to be missionaries in our neighborhoods, and we've got to be missionaries at our workplaces, and we've got to be missionaries with our kids' sports teams. We have to intentionally connect with people who wouldn't step foot in this building. And so we've got to ask ourselves, have we obeyed God completely as a church? Are we making disciples like we should, or have we been content with just letting people who come to the church come and hopefully they get involved, or have we been intentional about what Jesus has called us to do? One other area I want us to think about and address, an area to correct, is this. We've not passed the faith on to the next generation. We've not passed the faith on to the next generation. I know we've got pockets of that where we're doing good. I know we've got some groups and some classes and campuses that maybe are a little better than others, places that there's young families and there's young kids that are involved. But as a church, as a whole, we have not done very well at reaching the next generation and the next generation. In fact, it was the same problem that the people after Joshua had. A whole group of people came along after Joshua had died, and, well, let's read about it in Judges chapter 2. After that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things that he had done for Israel. So just a generation after Joshua, just a generation after that group of people had come in and marched around Jericho and had taken victory after victory in the promised land, the next generation, that did not get passed on to. There were people that did not hear those stories. There were kids that did not know about God's miracles. There were people that grew up and somehow missed out on the fact that God had been faithful to them, and a generation before had trusted them and they had been obedient to them, and somehow they missed it. And I look at that and I'm like, how tragic. How could that be? How could people of God fail to pass that on to the following generations? Well, it happens all the time. And I don't need to tell you, as a congregation, we're just getting older. I'm getting older. You're getting older. Everybody that's sitting here, that's just what's happening. And I don't need to tell you that that's the life cycle of any church. Unless something changes, unless something comes in and is different, everyone gets older until eventually everyone just gets older, and the only people left start dying off, and the church eventually dies. You've seen it happen. Maybe you've been a part of a church that it happens. It happens every day. Churches are shutting down because a group of people just were content to be the ones that were holding the fort down until they finally died off. We have to be intentional about connecting with a younger generation, with young children, and with teenage students, and with college-age people, and with young married people, and young families. And sometimes that means we put up with things that we don't personally like. Ben Merrill, who was a pastor in Southern California for many years before he retired and helped to start another church before he retired again, but spent a lot of time in Southern California. He talks about a lady named Elizabeth Dolan, a lady who was in her 80s and who was a real servant in the church. When he was in Southern California, this church had a student music group that was on the cutting edge of the contemporary Christian music of that day. And in fact, they were so talented that they were asked to sing all over Southern California. And Elizabeth Dolan, this 80-year-old lady, whenever possible, she would get on the bus and she would ride along with all of these kids, and she would attend their concerts. And the kids loved having her along, and she was a blessing to them. And someone once asked, "Does Mrs. Dolan really like that music?" And somebody else said, "No, Mrs. Dolan loves kids." And that's really the important thing, isn't it? Mrs. Dolan was 80. She didn't really care for the music, but she loved those kids. Ben Merrill says it was from that experience that he came up with a motto that he tried to live life by. He said, I will be willing to put up with things I don't like for the sake of reaching people who are not like me. I will be willing to put up with things I don't like for the sake of reaching people who are not like me. That's a great motto to live by, whether you're young or old, of realizing that my preferences are not the most important thing. In fact, who wants to come to a worship service built around your likes and your dislikes? Well, you do, but what about everybody else? And so the church does some things that are obviously connecting with the younger generation, and it's hard for you. Can I just ask you, would you just keep serving? Would you just keep loving a future generation and generations to come? In the book, A Million Miles in 1,000 Years, Donald Miller describes a New Year's Day parade that was held in San Diego that you've probably never heard of. In fact, it was no ordinary parade. This was a special parade organized by author Bob Goff and his family, a parade where nobody was allowed to watch because everybody was a part of it. So Miller tells a story about Bob Goff and his children just sitting around one day. It's New Year's Day, and all the kids were bored. In fact, one of the kids just kept talking about being bored, and they agreed that New Year's Day was one of the most boring days ever. And so he asked what it would take to make the New Year's Day less boring. They started a discussion of what kind of things that they might do. And so they started tossing out ideas. The kids started saying things, how about let's buy a pony? Or how about let's launch a rocket? And then one of them mentioned maybe having a parade. So Bob Goff, thinking that would be a good thing out of having to buy a pony, lit up, and they started thinking about a parade. And the kids sat around and started dreaming about costumes that they could wear and what they might look like, and balloons that they could hold, and what if they invited their friends to watch. And the kids started talking about what all elaborate things that they could pull off. And Bob's wife, Maria, began to plan a cookout at the end of the parade in the backyard. And she began to wonder, how many people do I prepare for? And then the kids started going out into the neighborhoods and started inviting people and calling them, inviting them to be a part of their parade. But Bob thought about it, and he realized it's so much more fun to be in a parade than it is to watch one. So he made this rule. Nobody would be allowed to watch the parade, but anybody could participate. Now, wouldn't you like to have been a part of some of those conversations on the front porch as you're talking with your neighbors? Hey, if the parade comes by, you're not allowed to watch it. You can jump in, but you can't watch it. Anybody could be in the parade, but nobody was allowed to watch. And so Bob and his family got down at the end of the street, and they began to call everybody else to come along. They put their fancy costumes on, and they walked, and people would join them as they participated. And they, as people would come out, they converted all of these parade watchers into parade participants. And by the time they got into their backyard, there were dozens of people who were joining in the cookout and eating hamburgers and having a great time. It wasn't a boring day anymore because people got involved and participated in a parade. You know, the truth is, it's a lot more fun being in a church, participating in the church, and being the church than it is just watching from a distance what a church does. And so in 2015, I'm going to ask you to do that. I'm going to ask you, maybe you've been at a place where you've just gotten comfortable. And maybe it's time for you to do something that gets you out of that comfort zone. Maybe it's as simple as being a part of a group. Maybe it's being involved in serving somewhere. Maybe for you it's going on a mission trip and you're thinking, that's scary. It's exactly what getting out of your comfort zone means. It could be that you have not been obeying God fully. Maybe you've been unsure about what it means to make a disciple. And we're going to spend the next couple of months with a new series called Our Story, where we're going to talk about when people obey what Jesus tells us to do and we let the Holy Spirit lead us. Well, it becomes our story, becomes your story, and it becomes future stories for people. Or maybe you've been a holdout. Maybe you've been more concerned about what you like, and you have not been a part of passing on a faith to a next generation. So maybe for this next year, it's just a part of you getting on board and you serving and you joyfully being a part of connecting with people and doing things that you don't like because you know that it's helping people who aren't like you. And so, Father, we're praying for your help in doing that in 2015. God, would you help your church to obey you fully by making disciples? God, help us to be a church that takes seriously the Great Commission. Help us to love people. Help us to be intentional. Help us, God, to open our mouths when we need to and to share about you. God, if there are places where we've gotten comfortable, we give you permission to pull us out of those comfort zones. And God, give us a passion for connecting with future generations that they might know you. Help us in Jesus' name. Amen.